start. So I'd like to welcome here today for this short briefing of our February workshop. We understood that the timing of the February workshop was not very conducive to those of you east of France, in the Asian region specifically, so we thought we would give you a short briefing. I'll now pass it over to Antonio Capiobianco, the acting head of the OECD Competition Division, to kick off this session. Antonio, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and good morning, everyone, and certainly a very good afternoon to those joining from the Asia-Pacific region. Many of you, due to time zone, as Lynn said, could not join us on the 25th of February when we discussed the OECD Gender Inclusive Competition Policy Project and the 7th selected research proposal. So I'm really delighted to welcome you all to today's session, which will summarize the discussion of that workshop and gather any additional insights that you may have. The OECD Gender Inclusive Competition Policy Project was launched last summer, summer of 2020, with the support of the Canadian government. So let me start by thanking again the Canadian government for its vision and wisdom in supporting this work at the OECD. Now, looking at competition enforcement and competition policy through a gender lens is part of a long-standing effort of the OECD and its competition committee to explore the links between competition and the many aspects of inclusiveness. In the past, we are focused on the relationship between competition and poverty reduction. That was back in 2013, and on the relationship between competition and wealth, competition and income inequalities back in 2017. More recently, last December, we looked at how sustainability can or should be an integral part of competition policy. And we will continue this discussion this year and look more closely at the role of environmental consideration in antitrust enforcement. And there are other aspects of inequality that might be relevant for competition policy that we hope to continue to explore. For example, racial inequalities that for the new acting chair of the US FTC has been referring in recent months, and we hear later it's also been an element of the work in South Africa. Our analysis of the question of whether gender should be taken into consideration by competition agencies started years ago with a session at our Global Forum on Competition in 2018. But it is really with this project that we go to the heart of the issue. We launched the project with a call for research proposals, and we were, I would say, overwhelmed by the responses to the call. More than 60 proposals from 49 different groups or researchers from 28 different countries responded. Proposals came from a very diverse mix of professional backgrounds. We had proposals from academics, staff or board members from competition authorities, private practitioners and NGOs. So I really want to thank each and every one of them and encourage them to pursue their research. And I would really like to offer them the opportunity to disseminate their work through our research platform on gender and competition here at the OECD. Our workshop last February brought together the experts from all over the world who are in charge of the 7 selected projects to present their work on gender inclusive competition policy and inform OECD guidance on the topic. So we heard in detail about each project, both on the topic and the methodologies were submitted to questioning from the participants. The workshop was divided in 2 parts, in 2 sections. The first section was on cartel and collusion. It was chaired by Isolde Leukenhausen, who is seconded to the OECD Competition Division from the ACCC until this June. And today she will provide you with an overview of the discussions that touch on collusion and the diversity of corporate boards and senior management, and ask whether a lack of diversity facilitates coordination and preserves cartel stability. The discussion also looked at gender differences in propensity to collude or to whistleblow, and whether there are ways to improve enforcement and compliance in light of these insights. The second session was chaired by Chris Pike. Chris has been leading the work on gender and competition, having written one of the first research papers and several blog posts while he was with us here at the OECD. This session explored the project that covered a diverse range of topics. The first topic showed how a gender lens may affect market definition analysis in merger reviews and antitrust investigations. It explores the potential impact of using a gender lens when designing or interpreting consumer surveys or undertaking critical loss analysis and event studies commonly employed in market definition assessment. The session also looked at how agencies with a consumer welfare focus could be using budgeting, resource allocation, and project selection decision to prioritize what they focused upon. Finally, discuss a South African project proposal which builds on the country's experience in using its competition law to address the country's past economic, social, and racial disparities by assessing effects on historically disadvantaged persons with gender considerations. So before I turn the floor to Nadia Bassos from the Competition Bureau of Canada to get us started with a presentation on an agency perspective on why a gender inclusive lens is important, let me just say that this is a new area of research with much uncharted territory that is yet to be explored. So I encourage all of you to ask questions, to participate and comment to help drive the thinking forward. So thank you all for being with us today. And Nadia, I give you the floor to get us kicked off.
Great. Thanks very much, Antonio. I'm just going to pull up some slides here. Great. So hopefully you can see those. But I'll start by saying very pleased to be here today. And thanks to the OECD for continuing to host these important discussions. My name is Nadia Bassos and I work in the International Affairs Directorate of the Competition Bureau of Canada. And before I get into any substance, if I say anything really out there, just know that they are my own words and may not necessarily reflect the views of the Competition Bureau or the broader government of Canada. So just a quick note to say that this presentation is accessible. So if you do run into any issues, please let me know and we'll correct those and get you a new version. So why is this important? I'll start by explaining that this is important because the decisions and approaches we take as competition law enforcers matter, and they affect people. The research being supported by the OECD will ultimately enable us as enforcers to do our jobs better. Like many said in the workshop, this is not a drastically different way of approaching our work, but the lessons learned will allow us to get a more nuanced understanding of the effects of our work and enable us to work towards outcomes that benefit a broader range of people and jurisdictions, not just a subset. The second reason this is important is because it, for people in Canada, aligns with a lot of Government of Canada priorities, but there's also international priorities like the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, goal number 5 on gender equality, but also goal number 10 on reduced inequalities. In the Canadian context, the outcomes of this research is going to help us implement what's known as the Gender-Based Analysis Plus policy. And I'll explain what that is on the next slide, but federal public servants are being asked to apply a lot of new policies these days, including something called Nothing Without Us, which is about accessibility. And we've been called on to take action on anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion. So all of this really supports that work. Finally, for us, at least at the Competition Bureau in Canada, this has been an opportunity to lead. Inequality issues are present in every jurisdiction. And as evidenced by these ongoing discussions, this is really relevant for competition authorities, not just the one here in Canada. And I think there's a real need to better understand the link between competition and inequality so that we can take that into account in our work. There's so much for competition authorities to learn, but also for businesses, practitioners, and academics, so that we can all think about how this has implications. So I did want to say just quickly on Gender-Based Analysis Plus that this is a tool that the Government of Canada uses for analysis. It's not specific to competition law at all, but it aims to help public servants ask questions, challenge their assumptions, and identify the potential impacts of various diversity factors in their work. So the research that the OECD is supporting is critical for improving our understanding of how to better apply this policy. And GBA Plus goes well beyond just gender. It includes a variety of identity factors, things such as race, sexual orientation, disability, age, income, education, and many more, which hopefully you can see on the screen. And if not, there is alt text for screen readers. But understanding those differences and intersectionality is the first step towards addressing them. And this came up quite a bit in the discussions at the workshop. But if you do want to know more about this tool, there is a free online course you can take, and you can just search GBA Plus course if you don't want to write down all of that website. So the Bureau's already been thinking about this and is taking changes to how it operates and how it goes about doing things. So I already mentioned the Nothing Without Us strategy, and that aims to make Canada's public service the most accessible in the world. So as I mentioned, this presentation is accessible, and that's one very small example, but these sorts of changes are happening across the board. We're also improving our ability to respectfully engage with different communities in culturally appropriate ways, and that may be things like having resources in different languages or engaging with Indigenous peoples in a more appropriate way than what may have been done in the past. And we're also offering things like our Black Book of Scams in a variety of languages beyond just English and French to reach a broader audience. So in my opinion, there are ways that we can already start to integrate this gender lens into the daily work of competition authorities. One way to do this is to just start asking ourselves questions. The questions on the slide are examples of the sorts of things we can be asking ourselves. These could continue to be discussed and evolve within the Competition Bureau, but I think it's a useful starting point for officials who want to start having conversations about this and just thinking about how our work affects different people. And I'm happy for the slides to be shared afterwards if anyone does want them. And on that, I will wrap up just to say a huge, massive appreciation to the OECD for continuing these discussions. I personally find the enthusiasm towards gender inclusive competition work really refreshing, and it's also timely and needed. So I hope this can be a tool not only to address gender inequalities, but also be broadly addressed, or to broadly address a range of inequalities. So thank you very much for having me today. And if anyone would like more information, you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly, either via the email or on LinkedIn. And with that, I will turn it over to Isolde. So thank you.
Thanks, Nadia. I will also just share my screen. Excellent. Welcome all, and a particular thank you to Lynn for organising this briefing and to Chris for organising the workshop itself. We're lucky today to actually have all of the speakers who actually presented at the workshop here. So what I'm going to do today is just quickly give a high-level outline of the projects, but I would really recommend going to the recorded video, which is available on the Gender Inclusive Competition Policy page. And this is a kind of a taster, and so that you can see them present in detail the projects themselves. If you're interested in following, I recommend also joining the LinkedIn group on competition policy and gender. And I've just outlined some key dates about the next steps that are coming up in the project. These slides will also be available to anyone who'd like them afterwards. So I'm going to introduce each of the projects in a second and the project leads on them. But this slide is just to outline that we had the 3 projects focusing on different aspects of cartel and collusion in the workshop, and I'll go into those in a detail in a moment. But we also had that format of having 2 discussants with each of the projects, and I think that was really useful for bringing out some of the next steps that might need to be taken with the projects and some of the interesting data and questions, some of them that Nadia just raised then, but also going forward. So I'd really like to thank all of those discussants for their role in both that workshop and their ongoing role in being a kind of a second pair of eyes on some of the projects and offering that kind of discussion. So the first project we heard from was from Justus Haukapp, Christina Heldman and Holger Rau. The project, this is one of the projects that creates new laboratory data. It asks questions of students, female and male, about their particular preferences, and the preliminary results showed that when there was going to be significant harm to outsiders, that there was less likely to be collusion, and this was particularly driven by women, and the men's results stayed the same. The next steps are going to be the project team will reveal the genders to both players, investigate whether identity affects the group composition, and if it plays a role in the willingness to collude. So this is a kind of a lab scenario, but it's creating new data and getting a sense of preferences. The next project was by Juan Roman Borrell, Carmen Garcia, Juan Luis Jimenez, and Jose Manuel Ordonez de Haro. That's my my best Spanish. Thanks, everyone. The project hypothesis was this: is that the women in a company, particularly in the board of directors roles, have a role in potentially reducing cartel engagement. And they're looking particularly at a treatment group of Spanish and European cases to look at when the companies were sanctioned and the evolution of the cartels in respect to the gender composition on the boards, and comparing that with a comparison group of organisations that hadn't been sanctioned. The preliminary results do show that there are some complementarities between the anti-cartel and gender policies. But interestingly, the presence of women on boards in terms of affecting the probability of forming a cartel, there was no significant effect. But by contrast, when they looked at the probability of a cartel breakup, there seemed to be a positive and significant effect on the presence of women in terms of that cartel breakup. The final project is by Alexis Brunel and Carolina Abate. This project hypothesis is about the preservation of shared values, basically boys' club networks being part of what creates and maintains cartels. And to look at whether this is actually occurring and the effects of it, they're doing two different types of methodologies. There's a theoretical framework based on behavioural economics, cartel studies, and white-collar crime and gender studies, so a multidisciplinary approach. And there's also a systemic analysis of cartel cases. So particularly looking at cases of the French Competition Authority to look at real life illustrations for boys' club dynamics in cartels. The preliminary results are that a gender imbalance constitutes an important risk factor for cartels, and they've even noted some preliminary potential responses, policy responses to this, including a potential relevance screening by competition authorities on a gender basis, and also to be included as a point of attention for compliance officials with corporate organisations. So the key takeout from the discussion came not only from the presentations, but also from that role the discussants played, as I was saying. And it was clear that from these three projects, there's a lot of interest, but also need to look at the data to research on this topic, and particularly look at it from different demographics and in the context of different jurisdictions. That was particularly raised in the context of the first project. We were collecting data at this stage from a student base in Germany. In the relation to needing better data, there was also discussion not only about new research creates data, but also the ability to have better access to data that is on the cases. Currently, a lot of people are using the Connor Cartels database, which has some information on gender, but this is something potentially that agencies could also create and have better transparency on. We know that there was a role for business to play in addressing some of these issues as they come in, not necessarily only waiting for policy responses and agencies to address these, but also for businesses to incorporate, for example, in their compliance programs, also a gender lens in considering how cartels are formed. And the potentials for uses for the research is still being considered, but all projects indicated that they could affect the way that either agencies behave, policy is developed, or, as I said, business response. So I'm now going to turn to Jamie Smith from the Fijian Competition Authority. He was one of the discussants of the day, to give his views on some of the discussion we had, and then hopefully we'll have some time to see if there's anything that the project researchers would also like to add. Thank you and welcome, Jamie.
Oh, thank you, yourself. I'll try and be relatively quick because I want to leave time for the project researchers, as you say. First of all, thanks for the summary of the research papers. I thought there's some very interesting research projects going on. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is the quite wide variety of approaches that you can see in the research project. So there's quite a big difference between two of the projects, which are very driven by existing data, and the experimental approach that was taken by DICE and the University of Göttingen. One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting is that there's a distinction between, on the one hand, the Heldman, Haukap and Rao paper, which focuses quite a bit on sort of the internal motivations or possible internal motivations of or psychological influences of potential cartel participants, with a focus on things like guilt and shame aversion, as against the others, which, using a sort of broader data set, don't have access to anything about the mental states of the participants. And so I thought that was it's a particularly interesting distinction, because it seems like it's kind of at the core of what we're getting at in some ways, is trying to understand more about what motivates cartel participants, whether that differs between men and women, and how that influences our cartel enforcement and possible action against cartel. So one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting is this emphasis on sort of social networks that you saw in some of the papers, and this sort of emphasis on boys' clubs and homosociality, and sort of being more willing to interact with people who are like yourself. So it's an interesting point about the potential risks that might arise from having, rather than necessarily men or women behaving differently per se, but a sort of homogeneity within the cartel participants. Having a sort of all men group of decision makers might look quite different to having one that's mixed. Not with even if there are no sort of underlying differences in the sort of general behaviors of men and women. And I thought this was there's a sort of, one of the kind of key questions that's raised by the research is the extent to which we want to be thinking about the sort of structural setup or gender balance of key decision makers in potential cartels, as opposed to how we want to be thinking about potentially the different psychologies of possible cartel participants. So as I was saying in the DICE paper, so that's the laboratory experiment paper, there's this emphasis on cartels breaking up, or cartels not being formed because of an aversion of some of the participants, particularly a relatively large subset of women, to shame and guilt. And they did a very interesting element of that paper where they vary the extent to which there's consumer harm arising from the cartel. So you can add a sort of third party to the prisoner's dilemma game, and you can change the extent to which they're harmed, and it influences the willingness, particularly of a subset of women who are highly averse to guilt, to participate. And that's one of the things that I thought was most interesting about that, because you can sort of vary all of the different components. You can change the extent to which outsiders are harmed. You can change the relative benefits to insiders. You can, and this is something which sort of complements the other papers, is that you can change the identities, or the participants' knowledge about the identities of other possible participants. So it helps to get at that sort of boys' club element. You can sort of address whether it really is an underlying difference in the psychological states of possible cartel participants, as opposed to whether it's just I cooperate with people like me situation. Because one of the things that it is particularly important to bear in mind here is that it's not just a straightforward case of, when you're dealing with a cartel, it's not just a straightforward case of cooperativeness or uncooperativeness or selfishness, because you're simultaneously dealing with other insiders in the cartel with whom you can cooperate, and outsiders. And there's an extent to which we can simultaneously think of people who are particularly cooperative either being potentially especially keen to engage in cartel conduct because it is a form of cooperation, or particularly averse to joining cartels because it's a sort of antisocial kind of behavior. So I think it's one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting about the DICE paper in particular, is this ability to just sort of manipulate the conditions of the test to see how it affects the outcome. Because it's sort of, there's a tension between the papers that I would be interested to hear more about from the researchers, because you have this finding that women are more likely to, having a high proportion of women in sort of key decision-making positions increases the chances of cartel breakup, but doesn't seem to necessarily do anything to, or at least we haven't found yet that it does anything to the possibility of cartel formation. So I'd be interested to see interested to take the views of the researchers on the interaction between that and this idea of guilt and shame aversion. Because you might think, well, if the reason that I'm not engaging in this kind of conduct is that I feel particularly bad about it and I don't like that and I want to think of myself as a pro-social person, why is that manifesting itself, seemingly anyway, in a difference in the willingness to break up a cartel that already exists rather than engage in a cartel in the first place? I mean, perhaps it's something to do with the data, but I'd be interested to hear from the researchers on that.
Jamie, I was wondering if with the time, is it maybe something we could turn to now, see if there is any comments on that?
Go ahead. Sorry, otherwise I'll ramble on.
No, it's excellent. It's just, we've just got the privilege of them all being there. If there's anything that I said that particularly the researchers would like to comment on, but particularly the point that Jamie was making there, I think Justus and Christina and Holger are online.
Yes, thanks very much. I hope you can hear me actually.
Excellently, yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for this for these again very valuable comments, and I would say discovered ourselves that there's so much more to explore really. So the question that you raised, Jamie, whether sort of how the differences may play out in the breakup and in the formation of cartels is something that we also thought would be very interesting to investigate further. We have to set up basically some sort of repeated game with possibly also with a leniency scheme in the experiment, and we as we already said in February, we are quite enthusiastic about all the sort of opportunities now in a way, because there's so many more ideas that we can use and drive this research further. So this is really, I think, the just the first experiment that we run, and I think we have quite a bit more to do over the next years probably to really find out what's the sort of mechanisms in more detail that are going on, and I'm really sure that we will sort of keep walking on this road.
Sorry, thank you, Justus. Were there any of the other researchers that wanted to add anything to my breakneck speed summary of your very detailed and important research projects?
Yes, Alexei.
Hi, Alexei.
Hello everyone. Just a few things to react to what Jamie said about the connection between this idea of guilt and shame that we find in DICE research and in our box club analysis. We have now finished the analysis of all cases between 2010 and 2021, and we have a bit more elements than we had in February. And it is clear that there is a difference in cases between men and women, and of course we cannot find like essential difference or internal difference, and I'm not sure it's what we can reasonably find in cases, but we can find interactional or situational differences that are very clear about how you formulate in words, the words used, how you formulate your participation in the cartel. And it appears that for the very few women that are completely involved in what we call the core coalition of the cartel, there is a much more pronounced tendency to say things plainly, like we are doing this. This is the price policy, etc., etc. While it appears that men are using a vocabulary that is more underhand, if I may say so. That is more blurred. So there is we could connect maybe this idea that there is always a way to reformulate things so as to make it understandable and clear and objective. That is clearly apparent from women participants, while men will have a more follow the leader policy. Like, I'm not really talking about what's going on, but I'm there, I'm part of the club, and that's all that matters. If we could find a difference, and that fits, and that fits with the first part of our theoretical framework, which is behavioral economics in cartels. For example, in Stucker's articles of 2010, he explains exactly this, how the way you reformulate and reformulate and reformulate what you're doing in interaction in time makes you feel it is legitimate. And this is something you can see actually in cases. But the way you do that appears to be quite different between men and women at the moment. But we have to, of course, to solidify this a little bit until May.
Thank you, Alexi. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for on our session, but just it reminded me what you were saying then, Alexi, that on the day too, we'd had a discussion about not about the usefulness of looking between the genders, but also the complications of universalizing or essentializing in relation to gender. And the same thing also applies with race and culture and the nexus between these trends along gender lines and also along race and culture, because this might also play out very differently in cartels and collusive conduct in different cultural contexts as well. So this is really interesting research for both policy and enforcement. Thank you all, and thank you particularly for Jamie, for the discussants and for the researchers who stepped in to add a bit more today. And I'll hand over now to Chris Pike. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Isolde. I'm going to try and do the same thing as Isolde and try to highlight a couple of the messages coming out of the presentations from part 2 and 3 of the workshop. Again, we're very lucky to have many of those leading those projects with us today. So I do hope you'll all correct me if I misinterpret anything or misrepresent, or if you have any new results that you want to share with the group, as we've just heard. So very briefly, part 2 of the workshop focused more on market definition, started with a presentation from Lola, Gunnar and Nicole from Auxera. They explained that in order to investigate whether the lack of a gender lens in the analysis of survey results has affected the conclusions that are being drawn, they've been re-examining consumer surveys in past cases to explore differences in responses by gender. And so they were relying on cooperation from agencies in the Netherlands, in the UK, Canada and Mexico, amongst others. But I do believe it's not too late to provide additional consumer surveys that you might have run in the context of mergers and market studies. Perhaps that window has passed, but if that's still open, I hope colleagues will emphasize that. Here, the focus really was on identifying whether accounting for gender when designing or interpreting such surveys might make a difference to the conclusions that are drawn from the analysis. So, for example, things like preferences, switching, consumer sensitivity to price and quality changes, and therefore eventually to market definition or competitive assessment. Some of the early points that have already emerged, I think, from the research have included the need to take to ask a gender question in the first place and collect the data, so that, you know, otherwise nothing's really possible if you don't have a survey split by gender lines. In addition, it was also noted that weighting surveys by the general population instead of by the consumer base of the product might be an important factor that agencies need to remember. While the results are obviously still preliminary and they're reviewing through the surveys, they did explain that in one case, aggregate data within a survey had suggested that the initial aggregate data had suggested that 6 out of 9 merging supermarket stores would not be able to raise prices following a proposed merger. However, when they went back and looked at this with a gender lens, they found that in 8 of the 9 stores, the diversion ratio towards the merging party store was significantly higher for men than it was for women, so up to 30%. And that means it's much easier for the merged entity to retain those consumers, even if they were to increase prices. That raises the possibility that if discrimination is possible, then at those 6 stores, which were effectively cleared, the parties might still be able to raise price for one gender after the merger. We had a discussion about the fact that in the context, simple list price discrimination between men and women is obviously not going to be possible in a supermarket sort of context. But you certainly could imagine that you could raise the price for products that are largely purchased by men, or that you could target mail out discounts or change the points awarded on a loyalty disc card or so forth. Or you might decide just to stock a smaller range or choice of products that are preferred by a particular gender. So there are a bunch of different ways that firms could still discriminate, which we know in other contexts has been done in order to capture the rent. So that was just one of the one sort of example of one of the surveys that they've looked at, and we really look forward to seeing what comes out of the other ones in due course. If I just press on first to the presentation by Marissa Jin and Joanna Posch from Analysis Group. Their project explores how applying a gender lens to market definition can be important in evaluating the potential competitive effects of a merger or anti-competitive conduct. And to do so, they were using web scraped data on the wet razor market, in which they had found both product differentiation and price discrimination, as well as the existence of disruptive entrants who were explicitly targeting gender groups. The data they scraped included prices, product characteristics, share of reviews, which was they were able to use as a proxy for market share. And they sought to use standard sort of merger tools to see what effect the use of a gender lens would then have. So, for example, they considered a hypothetical merger between 2 existing products that had been the information from which had been scraped from the web, and where there was already price discrimination. They looked first at the simple HHI changes and found the increment in HHI from the merger changed very significantly depending on which of the candidate markets you used, whether it was a only men's razors market or an only women's or both. And then they also ran a merger simulation on the data and found that the hypothetical merger that they were looking at would lead to something like an 11% increase in the price of women's razors and a 6 or 7% increase in the price of men's razors. So probably in that case, it would flag problems in either version. But it does flag that in that case, the pink tax would effectively grow by 24% in that case. So it would further distinguish the prices that are being set across the two. And they noted that the magnitude of that difference is obviously more than enough to change an agency's decision as to whether the merger reduces competition or not. So it could be very significant. In addition to demonstrating why a gender lens might be important, they were also discussing when and how to incorporate a gender lens in competition analysis. So, for example, while that sort of razor example, the gendered nature of that market is perhaps fairly obvious, does that mean agencies should be checking for the gendered nature of all markets? Or is it better to think about trying to find particular indicators that might be useful to identify when the sort of gendered nature of a market is important? And so here there was a bit of discussion about the sometimes surprising markets that you might find in where you might find price discrimination across gender lines and different price sensitivities and so forth. So for example, somebody brought up dry cleaning, Javier from the Spanish Competition Authority mentioned insurance and financial products, credit we know of as one. In other data, we've seen that things like flights, bank accounts, gas suppliers, and so on can also be areas where you do see some differences. Whether they would make a difference within the context of the case is obviously to be seen, but certainly there's scope for that. Marissa and Johanna said the focus will now turn to digging further into those types of less obvious markets, and they also flagged the question of how this applies in labour purchasing markets, where the pink tax manifests itself in terms of a gender wage gap. I believe that's outside the scope though of what they're planning to do, but it's certainly the sort of logical continuum of what's being looked at. Okay, so that was the first section that focused on market definition. Before I turn to Natalie, our discussant, I'll also say a few words about the third section, where we're fortunate to have presentations, firstly by Bill Kovacic. Bill's research looked at how competition agencies might go about applying the gender-related criteria when they're setting priorities and selecting projects to realise those priorities. He identified that there's a multiplicity of demands that competition agencies are subject to, and that a relatively short time in office can often mean that agency leaders don't always have an incentive to implement changes that might have longer term payoffs. He identified that agency staff are often rightly skeptical of passing fads and nice new mission statements. And he therefore focused on how prioritization and project selection could focus upon markets that matter to women as entrants, as owners, as workers, and as consumers, and how those changes could really be hardwired into agencies to ensure that they last. He suggested that to make those changes credible and durable, people in the agency need to be persuaded, and that a necessary but not sufficient condition is for agencies to themselves be more diverse, since that will indirectly move agencies towards including gender inequality within program design. He said this means things like personal audit at all levels. It also means organizational audits to assess how they're doing business internally. For example, looking at precisely who is responsible for allocating resources and evaluating the projects that they analyze on a year-by-year basis. He suggested that agencies also need to be doing policy R&D, including regular assessment to understand what they've been focusing on in the past and how that changes, which perhaps they should be doing anyway. And indeed, he noted that when he looks at the US FTC's record, it shows that already there has been a focus on markets that matter to low-income groups. And he emphasized that this shows that this type of prioritization can be done and has been done before. Finally, argued that the focusing on prioritization of work should be clearly disclosed, and in that respect, that linked well into some of the work that's been done on by the South African Competition Commission. As he takes the work forward and looks to provide practical proposals on the processes that agencies can adopt to implement prioritization and make it more durable, he suggested that one of the striking findings thus far from looking at the FTC's record has been the focus on removing artificial barriers to mobility in markets where women predominate as owners and as entrants into markets. So I think that will be something that is expanded upon in his project. And then the seventh presentation was by Mpumi Shabalala, Betty Makatsua, and Sonia Farazzi. Their project looks at the lessons that can be learned from the South Africa experience in using its competition law to address the country's past economic, social, and racial disparities by assessing the effects of mergers and conduct on historically disadvantaged persons. They argue in particular that in South Africa, in the South African context, where the law has always been very upfront about the inclusion of public interest considerations, it's important that those considerations be extended to include gender inequality. And indeed, they suggested that the absence of women from the definition is quite anomalous and reflects a real missed opportunity, not least because it overlooks that intersectionality of gender and race, and therefore limits the ability to tackle those deeper inequalities within society. They explained that their project will be looking at how a gendered public interest consideration might advance women's economic participation as owners, employees, and consumers. And in their preliminary findings, they had identified 4 pillars that they thought were key to the functioning of the existing public interest considerations in South Africa. Firstly, the purposeful framing within the law. This emphasizes how important it's been for the public interest considerations in South African competition law to be articulated very clearly and motivated within the preamble to the law. And they suggested that this was helping the authorities to identify how to implement the public interest consideration. Secondly, prioritization. Here they identified the way that the public interest considerations have helped the Commission to focus on sectors that are high impact for women, whether this be in relation to their position, the position of the sector within the value chain, or the care economy, or the informal economy. So that linked a lot across to what Bill had been talking about. Thirdly, they mentioned the importance of progressive or incremental implementation of some of these mechanisms, talking about the incremental building of enforcement in those areas. And fourth, stakeholder participation, and in particular full participation by business and their advisors, that they said was key, particularly in relation to mergers and merger remedies. So perhaps I'll leave it there. Let me ask first, before I cross back to the leaders of the research to see if they have any comments. Let me ask Natalie to make Natalie Heartstore from the Austrian Competition Authority to give us some of her sort of reflections on the event. Natalie.
Thanks, Chris. It's impossible to do all these great projects justice in a few minutes, but I'll just like to highlight a few reflections from my enforcement perspective. So what I find interesting when you now group sort of the market related projects with the public interest analysis and Bill's project is that for me, from an enforcement and institutional perspective, they would have to be reflected on at different levels in an organization, because the project on consumer surveys by Auxera is something that, if well responded to by economists in agencies all over the world, will be easily integrated by the experts, right? Similar for me with the analysis groups project. I think if this analysis is being then discussed at events and among economists, then I think it will be easily integrated into agencies' work. Whereas when we talk about the prioritization, public interest projects, then for me, for example, the really interesting analysis done on the South African experience is something that would have to be discussed at a competition policy level in each state, and also at management level, of course. But it's also something very political, so that would have to be subjected to like a national discussion by policymakers. And then the project by Bill is really something where, as an agency, management would have to be convinced that this is something they would like to implement, and that they would like to learn from the lessons that are reflected on in this project, on the experience of the FTC. So for me, from an enforcement perspective, the projects are very different and need to be reflected on further in different groups. And I think this is something that should be considered when taking then the final results of these projects forward, to think like in which format also at the OECD should they be further discussed and reflected on, because director generals will not be super interested in how exactly a consumer survey is drafted, but they might be really interested in thinking about how a gender lens should be applied to their prioritization decisions in their councils or something. So that's just one point. And I think that was also reflected in the discussions that took place after the different projects. For example, on Auxeria's project, I think Alessandra's points were really good, that she said that the more robust the analysis is, the better it can be brought forward. And even after this session, I had another discussion with Alessandra bilaterally, and we had both the same conclusion that that in our respective agencies we would have to launch a discussion, and of course the better the product is, the better we can convince our experts to take this lens, because the initial reaction will probably be as well to the market definition discussion will be like, of course gender plays a role. We've always taken this when it was necessary and when it was adequate. We took it into account anyways. And that was also something that I think was brought up, I don't really remember by which discussant, on the group analysis project, that this is taken into account anyways, but I'm not so sure it's really done. So that's why I think it's really good that that these projects bring some empirical evidence in what has really happened, and showcase that there might be a gap at the moment, and that actually it's not really taken into account as it should be. On Bill's project, where I was happy to be a discussant, I think for me, from an enforcement perspective, the main point was how can these results then be translated on a broader level for smaller agencies, for younger agencies. So how can it be internationalized, so to say? How can the results be internationalized? And also how to make the results last. And I think here we have to enter also into the discussion. Is there a difference between a gender lens and other lenses? And that's also something that we have to think about when we consider it as a public interest that should always be taken into account by agencies. Is there a difference between, let's say, sustainability and gender lens? Is gender lens something that is sort of even broader, or are these public interests all on the same level? At one point, I remember that was being discussed on the South African project was whether the experience from South Africa could really be translated into other jurisdictions. And I think here, for me, from my point of view, I think this 4-pillar approach that they have taken is really useful. And although, of course, each setup in each country is different, I think there's a lot to be taken from it. So from my personal view, I think it's very useful, and a lot of it can be actually translated, and is a good basis for discussion in each jurisdiction. So that was in a nutshell from my side. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Natalie. Maybe if we take the first, the part 2 first, in terms of market definition, because I think that clearly there is that useful distinction there in terms of the audience we're pitching towards. Maybe Lola or Nicole, or I think Johanna is with us from Analysis Group. Anything to add or clarify from?
No, I'll just say thank you, Chris, for an excellent summary of our workshop. I think that's a really crucial point that Natalie just raised, and that Alessandra raised during the workshop as well. That there are obviously a lot of points that authorities need to take into consideration, and that there are a lot of segmentations that you could look at, and that our role the coming months will be to provide sufficiently robust evidence that indeed gender is one of those areas that will be important to look at, and that will be worth the effort of authorities to look into.
Yeah, same from our side. Thanks a lot, Chris, for the very good summary. I also think that this point Natalie raised, obviously, that's something that we've also emphasized. We're thinking about a lot now as well. You know, people keep saying, well, obviously we're already looking at this, you know, when it's completely obvious that gender should be a consideration. But now what we're really kind of reflecting on is, what if it's less obvious, and what should we maybe be more actively looking for when it sort of doesn't, you know, hit us immediately in the face that gender might be something to consider in that market. That's really something we're thinking about now.
That's great. Okay, and then maybe Bill, you want to say anything to clarify on your end?
Thank you, Chris, for the wonderful summary, and Natalie, once again, for the continuing stream of extremely useful comments. Three themes I'd underscore. One is, I think, a great challenge with any set of proposed adjustments for managers is moving from a condition in which the task becomes something that in some sense they have to do because they've been told to do it, to something they want to do because it yields positive returns. And I think that's where the effort to identify exemplars from past experience that show that this works, you've done it before, it's not scary, and it was good for you. Indeed, doing some of the things that we make more explicit and identify and connect more directly to a gender-friendly approach in some sense has been good for you, and you embrace it. So what we're asking for is an extension or maybe a more explicit recognition of what you've done. But if you don't get managers to ultimately say, I want to do this, it's not something I have to do, but it's something I want to do, that's where you see genuine reform, when you've crossed that threshold, which, by the way, is a reason I think it's so important to have sufficient gender representation in key decision-making groups, because that gives you a greater assurance that you have more people who recognize that this is important and want to do it. A second thought that you underscore as well is and truly difficult complication. We're not looking in this project at the variety of considerations that Canada has enumerated as part of its program. But an interesting question is, if you take all of the demographic factors, age, geography, sexual orientation, religion, religious beliefs as a form of norms creation, wealth, race, are there overlapping Venn diagrams where you see a core of common concerns that you can take back to managers and say, if you do these kinds of projects, you advance the attainment of these other social objectives? But I think one thing we have to test or be aware of is do these considerations pull in the same direction? Different directions? How, if you take them all into account, how does it affect your program? I guess I have some confidence, but it's based on intuition. That's something I can prove, that there are overlapping areas of important concern. A last thing that I mentioned that I've seen in the conversations and feedback we've gotten is that we have to take this outside the agency level, that we have to look at all of the organizations involved in norms creation. Those include the large international organizations of which the project is a part, professional societies and others that shape views about what ought to be done, because they do influence what agencies do. And among the factors to look at are longstanding patterns of leadership and control by white men, to be one example. That is, how diverse is your leadership group? Is there adequate turnover over time to bring in new views? Or do you have longstanding patterns that could lock in place a particular perspective? So a number of commentators who've come back to us as a result of the workshop have said, you can't just look at agencies, you have to look at the institutions that press agencies to act in certain ways and develop general understandings about what agencies should do. But thanks once again for the chance to work on this, and to Chris and Natalie again for your continuing useful guidance about how to do this.
Thanks, Phil. Betty, anything from your side?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for the great summary of our project. I think I should first say that obviously there is a huge difference between what South Africa has done and what other countries are doing in terms of like using public interest considerations. And I mean, South Africa, you could say, is very radical in terms of using public interest considerations, and that's obviously owing to the country's history. What our project sort of does is that we provide a different sort of measures that can be used at different levels. So we obviously do assess the South African approach and what changes can be made from the South African perspective in order to include gender. And it's quite interesting that the authorities have, taken an interest in the project and wanting to get more information on the project and sort of discuss some ideas on how they can start, considering gender at this stage. And it's nice that from the South African perspective, due to the broadness of the preamble, that could potentially read in gender, even though it's not specifically listed as an element of the historically disadvantaged individuals. So there's more scope, I'd say, from a South African perspective to start thinking about these ideas. And in our paper, we also considering what measures can be adopted by other countries who might not have the same appetite as South Africa for these issues. So the 4 pillars really offer that, and what we would be including in our paper is obviously measures that can be adopted without making legislative changes. And some of the measures, I think I should mention that whilst not a lot of countries have public interest considerations, there are some countries, I'd say like Australia, where there is a public benefit element. And it could be that those countries might have to give meaning to what they mean by those concepts, like public benefit, if they're sort of not defined, and whether there's a possibility to meaning to those elements by including gender. And we do appreciate that obviously our project is more aimed at like a policy level, but we just thought that the insights from South Africa are very useful to highlight, so that when countries sort of go through this process, they sort of know what is it that they need to do. And I think the other key thing from the sort of political element of the public interest considerations, what is useful from our projects as well, is how we, as South Africa, have sort of tried to find a balance between the competition assessment of things and the role of public interest considerations as well. So not to take away the whole assessment and have it, through a sort of entirely political process. So I think it's really useful to highlight those insights. But at the end of the day, it'll all depend on what countries have an appetite for when it comes to public interest considerations.
Brilliant. Thank you, Betty. Thanks, everyone. With that, perhaps I can hand back to Lynn for the Q&A.
Thanks, everybody. So I just have a few remarks to close this session. My first thing is I note that Bill has joined us at roughly 4 or 5 in the morning, and I certainly appreciate that dedication. And on top of that, I also want to thank Isolde, Chris, Natalie, Jamie. Thank you so much for providing such a comprehensive overview. Our researchers, you're now part of the OECD family. To the researchers, thanks so much too for once again participating. And Nadia, Canada, thanks to Canada again for making this possible, and Nadia too for joining us. What I note is that not only have we recapped what happened in February, but we also seem to have moved the discussion forward, which indicates to me what a really rich topic this is. And there is something to be gained for us talking together and getting together. So I encourage you to continue the discussion on our LinkedIn group. If you have thoughts, if you have ideas, papers, please do share. And it is an open group, so invite your colleagues. We've had people from everywhere from the Seychelles, EC, Japan, Botswana, Korea joining us today, which again shows the interest of the topic around the world. I appreciate that Betty noted she wants to try in their research paper to ensure that the recommendations can be used across jurisdictions. there certainly seems to be an appetite for it. I also appreciate too, Natalie, Austrian, the need for rigor in order to convince those within authorities to pick up this topic, to use it in their competition policy enforcement. And I have no doubt that that rigor is certainly something that we will see within the papers. The sanitary crisis has adjusted our timeline somewhat. We're hoping to hold a public conference early in September to launch the papers. Not only will we ensure that our researchers are there, researchers, this is a heads up, early September, we need you. But we hope also to have other streams of work within this topic. We hope to profile them. So if you hear of anybody else that you think should be participating in this conference, please do let us know. The topic, the gender inclusive competition policy topic, will go beyond these research papers. We're hoping to put together a toolkit, which would be useful for Canada. And we hope also that the competition committee will pick up on this toolkit and support it so that we see it adopted across different jurisdictions and applied. I encourage you to join our LinkedIn group. We will be keeping you informed of what's going on. And on that, let me also thank the OECD team who made this possible, my colleagues who are behind the scenes, who we don't necessarily see, but without them, something like this certainly can never take place because it's a bit of an iceberg. What you're seeing on the surface is so little compared to what happened in the background to make all of this possible. So thank you very much for joining us. Stay safe and please keep in touch. Have a good day or a nice evening. Goodbye, everybody.